9 out of 10 of those are fucking some armory in New York. There's no showers, one pisser. You know, it's just, it's most of the guys are out for the weekend. You catch them on Sunday. They've had the same gear on for 2.5 days.
It's fucking horrendous.
He smelled like shit. That is how Kevin Nash said it. No hesitation, no apology, no softening the blow. Just the plain, raw truth dropped on his podcast like a steel chair to the skull. And when Kevin Nash says something like that, the whole wrestling world stops and listens. Nash has been in this business longer than most people can remember. He stood over 7 feet tall. He spent decades inside the most brutal locker rooms in professional wrestling. He saw everything the road could throw at a man. He survived all of it. He made it through with his stories intact and his reputation large enough to fill a podcast series. And now, on his podcast Click This, he is telling every story he was never supposed to tell. The stories he is sharing are not just surprising, they are genuinely disturbing. They are stories about real human beings in a world that treated them as attractions first and people a very distant second. A world where the sweat and blood of the men doing the work was considered part of the product. A world with its own rules. Rules nobody wrote down but everybody followed. Rules that determined who suffered and who laughed at the suffering. Give this video some hype right now. Hit that button, give it some hype, and keep watching, because we are just getting started and this story gets a lot worse before it gets better. These are the locker room laws. That is the phrase Nash uses to describe the unwritten code that govern life on the road. Not the storylines, not the matches, not the championships on the line, the real rules. The rules about who got the shower first and who sat in the heat for an hour waiting for cold water, who got the beer from the fridge and who was told to sit down and wait, who was protected and who was left to deal with the stink on their own. Nash is not telling these stories out of charity. He is not trying to educate anyone about working conditions or occupational safety. He is a man who had enormous power in that world, and he knows it very well. He had stroke. That was what they called backstage influence. Stroke meant you made decisions. You decided who got pushed up the card and who got buried. You went first in the shower. You laughed freely at the people who could not defend themselves. You turned their worst moments into amusing stories for a podcast a decade later. Nash had plenty of stroke. He always did. He still does. But the stories are real, every single one of them. And behind every laugh Nash gets from his Click This audience, there is an occupational disaster that the wrestling industry never fixed, never apologized for, and never properly acknowledged. Because acknowledging it would have meant doing something about it. And doing something about it would have cost money. Today we are counting down 10 wrestlers whose hygiene stories Kevin Nash has told on Click This. We are going from number 10 all the way down to number 1. The higher you climb, the worse the story gets. By the time we reach number 1, you will understand exactly what the locker room laws really meant for the men who had no choice but to live them. To understand any of this, you first need to understand the road. In the 80s and 90s, professional wrestling meant you were away from home for 250 to 300 days every year. That is not an exaggeration. That was the calendar. You wrestled almost every single night in a different city. You drove through the night to reach the next venue. You slept in cheap roadside hotels when things went well. You slept sitting upright in a rental car when they did not. There was almost no time to do laundry. There was almost no time to clean your gear. You finished a match, drenched in sweat and blood and whatever chemicals were ground into the ring mat, and then you climbed into a car for a 6-hour drive. That was the job. That was simply the job, and nobody pretended otherwise. The gear was the first casualty. Wrestlers wore heavy leather masks, thick singlets, elaborate arm tassels, and padded boots that absorbed everything the body produced. Every single item collected sweat, blood, saliva, and ring mat grime over weeks and months without a proper wash. Because the schedule never stopped, the gear never had a real chance to dry out between uses, let alone get properly cleaned. Masks went from tour to tour without being washed. Boots sat in sealed bags for weeks at a time. Tassels trapped layer upon layer of dried sweat with nowhere to go. The gear did not just begin to smell bad over time. It became something else, something with its own biological presence, something that seemed to operate independently from the man wearing it, and not in a way anyone sharing a changing room with it was grateful for. Kevin Nash sat near the top of that food chain for most of his career. He had stroke. He got the shower. He got the front seat. He got to tell these stories now on his podcast, and to decide who comes across badly and who comes across with dignity. He laughs while he tells them. He makes his audience laugh along. That is his right. But it is worth knowing where he was standing while all of this happened. He was not the one waiting for cold water. The business was built on this structure. There was no accident in it. The men who ran the wrestling companies in that era knew exactly how the road worked. They knew the shower situation and the gear situation and the bus situation. They booked the schedule anyway. They put the wrestlers on the road for 300 days and they cashed the gate receipts and they moved on to the next town. The workers were a resource. Resources got used. The locker room laws were the workers' own way of managing a situation the company had created and had no interest in solving. Nash understood all of this. He understood the laws because he learned them at the bottom and then enforced them from the top. He knows exactly what kind of system he is describing when he sits down to record "Click This." He knows that these stories are not just funny. He tells them anyway. He tells them with a laugh and a shake of his head and a delivery that makes the audience feel like they are in the locker room with him. That is what he is good at. That is what stroke sounds like when it is translated into entertainment. Now we count them down. Number 10, Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious was a physical specimen who looked every single bit the part of a professional wrestler. He was tall, he was broad. His physique made an argument that his body could back up. And for a long time, in terms of pure visual presentation, it did. But in the locker room, looking the part only got you so far. You also had to be sharp. You had to read a room. You had to navigate the politics without embarrassing yourself or the people around you. And that is precisely where Sid repeatedly came unstuck. Nash and Scott Hall made Sid a target. It was sustained and it was deliberate. They had the stroke to do it and they used it freely and without much concern for how it landed. Sid once tried to defend himself against their teasing in front of an audience that remembered everything. He said, "I'm not as dumb as I look." He meant it as a comeback. What the room heard was a confession. He had accidentally confirmed everything they had been saying about him. Nash has repeated this story on "Click This" so many times that it has become one of the signature bits of the podcast. He genuinely cannot let it go. He has never wanted to. Nash talked about how Sid struggled to navigate the political hygiene of the locker room. He would start a promo, lose the thread, and land somewhere that confused everyone who was watching. Promos that went badly could follow a man for months in that world. People remembered. Nash especially remembered. In the locker room, the ability to cut a sharp promo and read the political landscape was its own form of currency. If you could do those things well, you had value beyond your size and your physique. You had the kind of value that protected you when the veterans decided to make someone a target. If you could not do those things, you were a liability. You were someone who could not be trusted with certain situations. Sid, for all his physical gifts, fell into that second category over and over again. And Nash made sure the story stayed alive so everyone kept remembering it. In that world, being sharp was the same as being clean. If your mind was a mess, you were as much of a hygiene problem as a man who had not changed his gear in a fortnight. Sid was the target Nash chose to make that point most clearly and most consistently. The mockery was the mechanism. The locker room laws determined who had the power to do that and who had to absorb it. Nash had the power, Sid absorbed it. And the story kept getting told on podcasts years after Sid had no way to respond to it. Number 9, The Ultimate Warrior. The Ultimate Warrior produced some of the loudest and most electric crowd responses in wrestling history. His music hit and the arena lost itself completely. He sprinted to the ring like a man who had been lit on fire. The audience believed in him with a fervor that most performers could only dream about. On television, in the lights, surrounded by the noise and the energy of a packed arena, he was a genuine phenomenon. Backstage, the view was considerably different. The specific problem was the gear. Those arm tassels were integral to the Warrior's look. They were thick, heavily layered decorations that swayed as he ran and bounced as he worked. They were part of the image. They were also, over time, containers for everything the Warrior's body produced during a match. He ran to that ring every single night. He worked with enormous physical effort. His body generated heat and sweat at a significant rate. The tassels absorbed everything. And because of how thick and tightly constructed they were, the moisture never fully dried out between shows. It just sat in the material, night after night, tour after tour. The tassels became something that announced the Warrior's presence presence before he came into full view. Nash questioned the Warrior's professional value for a long time. He doubted his in-ring psychology and his ability to construct a match that built to a proper finish. Hulk Hogan had described the Warrior as a flash in the pan in private conversation. The locker room had formed views about his technical ability and about his attitude toward the established order of the dressing room. He was seen as someone who had been handed a platform he had not fully earned through the grind that everyone else had gone through. But before all of that, before any professional criticism could be properly framed, there was the immediate physical fact of working near a man whose gear carried that kind of persistent and unmistakable aroma. The Warrior never built the relationships in the locker room that protected a performer from the scrutiny of the veterans. He did not play the political game or learn the laws. He was treated as an outsider. And when Nash criticized him, whether about the psychology or the tassels or the attitude, there was nobody in a position to push back. The Warrior was on his own in the room. The tassels were the most tangible and immediate version of a much broader problem. And Nash made sure the problem stayed on the record. Number 8, Bastion Booger. Some of the men on this list were dirty because the road gave them no alternative. Their hygiene broke down because the system they were inside made proper hygiene nearly impossible. Bastion Booger is different. Mike Shaw was handed a character whose entire reason for existing was to be visibly, deliberately, offensively disgusting. The WWF built a gimmick around the idea of filth as entertainment. Vignettes were filmed showing Booger eating rotten food and displaying behavior that made audiences cringe. He was promoted as something genuinely repulsive. The crowd reacted the way the company needed them to react. The gimmick worked on that level. It generated the response it was designed to generate. But Nash has talked about what the character cost Mike Shaw in a more personal sense. To maintain Bastion Booger, Shaw had to carry the character into the locker room. He performed the disgust on camera and then walked back into a dressing room full of people who had just watched him perform the disgust. The perception did not reset when the camera stopped rolling. Backstage, he was still the gross one, the repulsive one, the man whose value to the company was in being an object of ridicule. That stigma traveled with him. Shaw did not have the stroke to reframe how the locker room saw him. He did not have the political capital to change the narrative. He was where the company put him, and he performed what the company required, and he carried the psychological weight of that gimmick without the protection that stroke would have given him. Nash tells the Booger stories with a detachment that tells you something important. He was not the one living inside the humiliation. He was the one observing it from the front of the bus, noting it for future podcast material, while Shaw remained defined by the worst version of himself that the company had invented. Number 7, King Kong Bundy. Nash tells the bus story clearly, and it paints a precise picture of how resources were controlled on the road. He was early in his career, not yet the figure he would become. He was on the babyface bus, traveling from one city to the next on a route that felt like it had no end. The bus had air conditioning. Then the air conditioning failed. The wrestlers sat in their underwear and tried to manage the heat any way they could. Half a dozen large men in a sealed vehicle on a summer motorway with no airflow and no relief. The back of that bus developed an atmosphere that was its own kind of challenge. Body heat, hours of accumulated sweat, no ventilation. That was the environment. King Kong Bundy was on that bus. Bundy was a veteran who had been around long enough to have built a clear and unambiguous position at the top of the vehicle's unwritten social order. He did not need to state his position. He simply occupied it and expected everyone else to understand. Nash went to the fridge to get some beers. He reached for the handle. Bundy put his foot against the fridge door. He looked at Nash and said, "I think you've had enough, big man." Nash was not drunk. The amount consumed was not the point. The point was who controlled the fridge. The fridge was a resource. Cold drinks were comfort. On a bus with broken air conditioning in the summer heat, cold drinks were one of the only available forms of relief. And that resource belonged to the man with the most seniority. Newcomers sat in the heat and waited for permission. That was the law. Nash became the man with stroke later in his career. He tells this story with a laugh and the air of someone recounting a charming rite of passage. But the structure of the story is the same structure that governed everything else in that locker room. Seniority determined comfort. Everyone below seniority dealt with the stink and the heat and the lack of access, and they said nothing because saying something would only make their position worse. The Bundy fridge moment is a small story, but it is a precise one. one. It tells you everything about how the laws worked at ground level. Number 6. The Nasty Boys. Jerry Saggs and Brian Knobbs did not need to manufacture a reputation for filth. They came with one attached. Their gimmick described their reality. They were rough, they were aggressive, and they did not moderate their behavior based on whether cameras were rolling. The locker room knew to give them a wide berth. They got into genuine physical confrontations outside of matches, and they did not back down from them. The fight with Ken Shamrock ended with a broken sternum and a broken nose. Recovery took months. That was the level the Nasty Boys operated at when things escalated. Nothing was dialed back. Nothing was managed. The confrontation ran its full course, regardless of consequences. Their presence in the locker room environment added to the biological hazard in a direct and measurable way. Ring mats in that era absorbed years of material from hundreds of performers. No proper sanitization protocols existed. The Nasty Boys contributed to that environment with the same energy they brought to everything else they did. They were a genuine physical risk to the people they worked alongside, and they appeared to regard this as entirely normal. The stink was part of the reputation. The reputation was part of the job. People gave them space. Nobody wanted problems with the Nasty Boys, and the Nasty Boys understood that very well. The stink was a deterrent. The violence was an advertisement. The two things worked together to keep the Nasty Boys right where they wanted to be in the hierarchy. Number 5. Scott Hall. Scott Hall was the man Nash called his brother, his closest friend in the business. And the Hygiene story involving Hall is one of the most physically direct examples on this entire list. It happened during a confrontation with Jerry Saggs in a WCW ring. Not a worked match, a shoot, a real physical altercation between two men who had genuine grievances with each other, happening in front of a paying crowd who did not fully understand what they were watching. Saggs threw a punch that knocked one of Hall's teeth completely out. The tooth traveled several rows into the crowd. The impact also punctured Hall's cheek from the inside. A real hole opened up in the tissue. That puncture was an open door straight into Hall's body from one of the most contaminated environments imaginable. Ring mat bacteria. Bacteria from Sagg's hands, and whatever those hands had touched that day. The accumulated contamination of a locker room with no meaningful sanitization protocols. Hall's mouth filled with infection almost immediately. His face began to swell, visibly, quickly. His body was responding to a serious bacterial invasion in real time, while the audience was still trying to work out what had happened. Hall did not go out that night. Nash stayed close. He stood near the showers with a baseball bat, ready to back up his friend if the confrontation continued. That was the medical and security response available to them. A baseball bat and loyalty. Not antibiotics, not a proper clinical assessment, not a hospital. Those things existed in the world outside. Inside the laws of that locker room, you dealt with it yourself, and you dealt with it among the people you trusted. Hall's later years carried the weight of everything the road had put into him. The infections from that night were one part of it. The drinking, the injuries, the accumulated psychological damage from years in that environment, all of it compounded. Nash has spoken about Hall's struggle with PTSD and his reliance on alcohol as a way of managing internal damage that had no other outlet. His attempt to get clean later in life was an attempt to remove what the road had deposited inside him over decades. The bacteria in his cheek was one night. The total accumulation was a lifetime. Nash wanted gold-plated toothpicks for Hall. That detail tells you everything about what Hall meant to him and about what the road had taken from a man Nash considered his brother. Number 4. Andre the Giant. There was nobody in the history of professional wrestling like Andre the Giant. His physical presence changed the atmosphere of every room he entered. The men who wrestled him describe it in terms that make it clear that no comparison is fully adequate. He was not simply large. He was on a different scale entirely, and the world was built on a completely different scale to his body. That gap between what Andre was and what the world could accommodate destroyed him across the course of a career that ran far longer than his body could reasonably support. Andre had acromegaly, a condition where the body continues to grow past the point that its own structure can sustain. By his later years, every movement cost him something significant. The bones and the joints that had made him famous were the same bones and joints that now caused him constant pain. He drank heavily to manage that pain. It was not recreation. It was a functional strategy for getting through each working drinking day on a road that had no provisions for a man in his condition. The alcohol was crude and damaging, but it was available and it worked in the way he needed it to work. The consequences of the drinking manifested during a match in Japan against Bad News Allen. His body could not process everything he had put into it. The ring became the place where that internal breakdown became public. The smell was overwhelming. His colleagues in the locker room handled it in the way they handled most things too painful to approach directly. Jokes. Dark humor at a safe distance from the reality. But behind every joke was something all of them knew. Andre could not use a standard toilet. His body did not fit. He could not use a standard bath. Every single day on the road involved solving the most basic human problems in ways nobody around him could fully appreciate. He managed with whatever was available. He kept showing up. He kept doing the job because that was who he was. The locker room respected him deeply because of exactly that. They saw what it cost him. They joked because the alternative was to face the full weight of what they were watching happen to him. Dark humor was the coping mechanism available. It was clumsy and it was inadequate, but it was what they had. And underneath every joke they told at Andre's expense was the unspoken acknowledgement that this man was enduring something none of them could fully comprehend and that none of them could fix. Nash tells this story with the same grin he brings to most stories. But even Nash pauses when the conversation turns to Andre. The man suffered. That pause says more than the grin does. Number 3, Yokozuna. Yokozuna was one of the most profitable attractions the WWF had in the early 90s. The company built entire programs around him. The audience responded with the fear and the awe the company needed. He was a genuine box office draw. He was exactly what the company wanted. And the company never stopped to build a world that Yokozuna could actually survive in day to day. When Yokozuna sat in the passenger seat of a standard town car, he sat noticeably higher than the driver. The seat could not contain his volume. His body was simply not compatible with standard transport. The company put him in those cars anyway. City after city, night after night, no modification, no alternative arrangement. He sat higher than the driver, and he managed it because there was no other option. On long-haul international flights, the situation became a recurring crisis. Aircraft lavatories are built for average-sized bodies. For Yokozuna, they were physically inaccessible. He could not fit through the door. Even if he partially entered, the door could not close behind him. On a flight lasting 8 or 10 hours, that was not a minor inconvenience. That was a fundamental failure to provide for a basic human need during a long journey that the company had booked. The locker room came up with a solution themselves because nobody else was going to. When Yokozuna needed to use the lavatory on a flight, someone would go to the galley and collect large rubbish bags. A group of wrestlers would position themselves around the lavatory entrance and hold the bags up, creating a makeshift privacy screen. The door could not close, but the bags provided a barrier between Yokozuna and the other passengers. The men stood there with their arms raised, holding those bags in place so that Rodney Anawai could have one moment of basic human privacy. Hold that image in your mind. Professional wrestlers standing in the aisle of a commercial aircraft, holding rubbish bags in the air so their colleague could use the toilet without an audience. Not because the company arranged anything appropriate, because the boys decided that was what you did for a teammate. It was a communal act of decency in the middle of a system that provided none. It was the locker room taking care of its own because nobody above them in the structure was going to do it. Nash describes it with a fondness that is genuine. He remembers Yokozuna as a great guy. The fondness and the brutality of the infrastructure failure exist in the same story without canceling each other out. Then there was the Capitol Center. Nash calls it brutal. Yokozuna was using a wall-mounted toilet in the venue locker room. The fixture was not designed to bear his weight. The porcelain cracked and then shattered completely. The pieces cut him. He was physically injured by a toilet in a professional wrestling venue because nobody in a position of responsibility had ever asked whether the building's plumbing was capable of supporting one of their headline attractions. The industry wanted Yokozuna on the road. It did not invest in making that road survivable for him. Number 2, Abdullah the Butcher. Abdullah the Butcher was in a category entirely his own. His body was a permanent record of his career, written in scar tissue. You could read his entire professional history on his forehead if you were willing to look closely. Abdullah bladed throughout his career. Blading was the practice of using a concealed razor to cut your own forehead during a match, producing blood that the audience read as a consequence of the action in the ring. Abdullah did this so many times across so many decades that the skin of his forehead changed permanently. Specific areas never properly healed. Deep, cavernous scarring developed in multiple spots. Openings in the tissue that look like permanent features of the face. They never fully closed because they were never given enough uninterrupted time to close. Abdullah went back to work. He opened them again. That was the business model. The demand for the opening was real. In Japan especially, where Abdullah was a major draw, the promoters valued the blood he produced. They wanted it in the matches. They made booking decisions that reflected that desire. Abdullah delivered because it was what he sold. The scars were the cost of the commodity. The hygiene conditions around those scars were genuinely dangerous. Locker rooms in that era were not clean places. Contaminated water was shared. Wrestlers used sinks as toilets when the facilities were full or broken. Bacteria moved freely through shared surfaces and equipment. Abdullah's open scar tissue was exposed to all of that constantly. He was introducing a contaminated environment directly into open wounds on his face, repeatedly every time he worked. Bloodborne pathogens, bacterial infections, risks that in any normal professional context would result in immediate medical intervention and a halt to work. In that context, those same risks were considered part of the act. Nash described Abdullah's physical presence in a way that the research made vivid. He said Abdullah would blade the seats of a car just by sitting in them, not literally, as a way of saying that the man's career had become inseparable from his body. The scars, the dried blood, the antiseptic agents used to keep the worst infections from taking hold, all of that was now permanently attached to him. There was no off-duty version of Lawrence Shreve that existed apart from Abdullah the Butcher. The road had removed that distinction completely. To lock up with Abdullah was to place your face against decades of accumulated biological history from locker rooms across multiple continents. Wrestlers who work with him knew what they were walking into. It was absorbed into the reality of the job. Nobody enjoyed it. Nobody ever fixed it. And the business that kept booking Abdullah never stopped to ask whether the product it was selling was costing the man producing it more than any paycheck could justify. Nash tells the story with blunt clarity. Even by his standards, Abdullah's is a different category. Number 1, Vader. We have reached the top of the list. Number 1, the most widely described, most vividly remembered, most consistently referenced hygiene story in Kevin Nash's entire catalog of Click This material. The Man, the Mask. Vader, whose real name was Leon White, was one of the most physically credible and most respected workers of his era. He was enormous, and he was genuinely stiff in the ring. His strikes landed with real weight behind them. When Vader hit you, everyone watching believed it because it looked exactly like what it was. He worked globally at the highest possible level. In Japan, he was considered one of the most legitimate performers in the business, and he spent long seasons there proving it night after night. In WCW, he was a significant television name who could carry a program. He was taken seriously everywhere he went. The man had a track record that spoke for itself. The people who worked with him, whatever they said about the smell, respected what he was capable of in that ring. And everywhere he worked, the mask came with him. Vader's mask was a heavy construction of leather and rubber. It was large. It was detailed. It was completely central to the Vader identity. Without the mask, you had Leon White. With the mask, you had Vader. The mask was the brand. It was what the audience responded to first. It was what made the entrance work. Nobody inside the company or outside it was going to suggest that the mask needed to be replaced or cleaned in a way that changed its texture or its weight or its aged appearance. The mask looked the way it looked because it had been through what it had been through. That was the point. And so the mask went on every tour to Japan, where Vader had long and intense working seasons in hot venues with no air conditioning and crowds packed in close. To Europe, where the schedule was relentless and the facilities were variable. Back to the United States, where television tapings meant multiple performances in short windows. Every single one of those matches contributed more biological material to the mask. Sweat went into the leather and stayed there. Blood found its way into the seams in the interior padding. Saliva collected in the lining. The heat generated inside the mask during a match created a warm, moist, enclosed environment where bacteria had everything it needed to thrive. And none of it was ever properly removed, because removing it would have required a cleaning process that the mask could not survive as an intact piece of equipment. Year after year, tour after tour, no proper cleaning, no replacement, just accumulation. Nash and the wrestlers who worked with Vader during this period described the mask using a phrase that became the standard. They called it a sentient being. That is not a compliment. A sentient being has its own consciousness, its own presence in a room. What they were saying is that the mask had developed such a distinct and overwhelming presence of its own that it existed as something separate from the man wearing it. When Vader walked into a changing room, the mask arrived first. Everyone knew it was there before they fully processed that Vader himself had entered. For opponents, working with Vader meant pressing your face against the mask. There was no avoiding it. The collar and elbow tie-up, the clinch, the grapple, every standard wrestling position that required close contact placed your face directly against years of accumulated biological material from every country and every promotion the mask had passed through. The Vader stink was a rite of passage. Wrestlers who worked with him regularly talked about it openly among themselves. If you were going to work with Vader, you were going to get the mask. That was known. That was accepted. Nobody enjoyed it. Nobody could change it. That was the locker room law at its most fundamental. You adapted to the conditions. The conditions did not adapt to you. What makes Vader the #1 on this list is not simply the severity of the smell. It is what the situation represents in the context of everything else on this countdown. The mask could not be cleaned without dismantling what made Vader commercially viable. The character and the contamination were inseparable. The industry got exactly what it wanted from Vader. It got the credibility and the menace and the television ratings and the quality of the matches. And the mask, year by year, was what paid for all of that. Every performer who ever had to press their face against it paid some portion of the bill on Vader's behalf. That was the locker room law at its most complete. The product was all that mattered. The cost was distributed among the people closest to it. That is #1. Now you have all 10. Sid Vicious at number 10. The Ultimate Warrior at number 9. Bastion Booger at number 8. King Kong Bundy at number 7. The Nasty Boys at number 6. Scott Hall at number 5. Andre the Giant at number 4. Yokozuna at number 3. Abdullah the Butcher at number 2. And Vader at number 1. Each one a different version of the same story. Each one a different point of entry into the same system. Nash tells the truth about them. That is what Click This is really for. That is the function it serves beyond the entertainment. It is a record, not a complete one, not a perfectly fair one, not a record told from the bottom of the card, but an honest one. And in an industry built on illusion, on characters and storylines, and carefully managed mythology, an honest record is worth something significant. It is worth something that the man telling it is still standing, that he is still remembering, that he is still naming names and putting the specific detail on record, even when that detail is genuinely disturbing. The stink of the road has faded now. The standards are better. The care is better. The wellness policies that eventually came into the industry changed the reality for the men who came after. But the men who came before paid the price that made the business valuable enough to eventually care about their welfare. They absorbed the stink and the infections and the broken toilets and the bacterial punches. They held the rubbish bags for each other. They managed. They kept going. And they made the industry what it became. That is the context you need when Nash laughs on his podcast about all of it. And through Nash, they keep being told. Not always generously, not always from the most balanced perspective, not always with the full picture of what it cost the men who did not have his position, but clearly, without the mythology getting in the way of what actually happened. That is the real locker room law, the last one, the one that outlasts all the rest and cannot be enforced away or ignored. You lived through all of it, then you talked about it honestly. And if you were still standing when people finally wanted to hear the full and honest truth, you made sure they heard every last word of it.